Alessandro Montanari, a visionary businessman from Naples, Italy, had just landed in the picturesque city of Kyoto, Japan. His business, Montanari Automotives, was renowned for its high-quality automobile parts and innovative designs. To expand his enterprise further, he was in Kyoto to finalize a critical partnership with a prominent local manufacturing firm. Several rigorous days of negotiations later, Alessandro successfully secured the agreement. It was a crucial accomplishment that would propel his business to new heights. Drained yet triumphant, he decided to indulge in some leisure time to explore the enchanting city of Kyoto. His ventures led him to a historic market in the city's heart, an eclectic mix of vibrant stalls offering everything from exquisite handmade pottery to premium sake. Amid the array of colorful merchandise, a peculiar mask piqued his interest. It was grotesquely fascinating, boasting exaggerated features and a strangely compelling aura. Despite its oddity, Alessandro felt an irresistible pull towards it. He approached the stall, examining the mask up close. It was a remarkable piece of craftsmanship, with eyes that seemed to harbor an inky depth, inviting and intimidating simultaneously. The mask, constructed of smooth, polished wood, was meticulously carved and painted in a surreal mix of vibrant and dark hues. The vendor, an elderly man with lines of age etched deeply into his face, watched him closely. On inquiring about the price, Alessandro was taken aback by the surprisingly low figure. Without a second thought, he pulled out his wallet, handing over the money to the vendor, whose sigh of relief was too profound to ignore. Now the mask was Alessandro's, and an uncanny chill seized him as he held it. It was as though the mask breathed tales of yore, casting an eerie shadow on his excitement. Dismissing the feeling as an effect of the market's lively ambiance, he clutched his purchase and left. Emerging from the market into Kyoto's bustling streets, Alessandro was plagued by an unsettling sense of being observed. He felt a lingering gaze on him, an insidious feeling of being followed that would persist long after he left Kyoto's charming confines. Alessandro Montanari's days in Kyoto were marred by a mounting sensation of being watched. It was as if his every move was being tracked, every step shadowed by an unseen observer. He attributed this disconcerting feeling to the peculiar mask he had purchased, a constant source of intrigue and unease. Its grotesque charm seemed to have invited more than just curious glances. With his business objectives fulfilled, Alessandro returned to Naples, hoping to leave behind the unsettling sensation. His relief at being back home was palpable. However, the eerie feeling of being stalked persisted, casting long shadows of fear and suspicion on his familiar surroundings. One chilling evening, his fears took a horrifyingly tangible form. Alone in his stately house, Alessandro heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. A surge of adrenaline coursed through his veins as he realized an intruder had invaded his sanctuary. He rushed downstairs, the mask held tightly in his hand. A shadowy figure stood in his living room, obscured in the dim light. The intruder made a single, raspy demand. "Give me the mask." A chill snaked down Alessandro's spine. How did the stranger know about the mask? Was he the one who had been following him? Overwhelmed by fear and a strange sense of possession over the mask, Alessandro defied, "Why should I? Who are you?" The response was immediate and violent. The intruder lunged at Alessandro, leading to a ferocious struggle. In the ensuing chaos, Alessandro landed a powerful blow, felling the intruder. Heaving and disoriented, Alessandro retreated, his hand instinctively reaching for the mask he had dropped during the fight. But it wasn't there. In rising panic, he touched his face, only to find the smooth wooden surface of the mask affixed to his skin. It had somehow found its way onto his face during the fight. A surge of power unlike anything he had ever experienced coursed through him. It was a maelstrom of terror and exhilaration, a potent combination that held him in its thrall. The mask was no mere artifact. It was a gateway to a realm of unthinkable power, and Alessandro had just become its latest disciple. Alessandro Montanari, still catching his breath from the brutal confrontation, stood in his ransacked living room. His gaze fell on the motionless figure of the intruder, his mind reeling from the terrifying ordeal. It was then he realized the mask was not in his hand. A sinking feeling of dread spread through him. He instinctively reached up to his face, his fingers encountering the smooth wooden surface of the mask. It had somehow affixed itself to his face during the fight, clung to him like a second skin. The realization was as baffling as it was alarming. He could feel the contours of the demonic visage pressing against his skin, and with a shudder of revulsion, he tried to remove it. But the mask didn't budge. Panic set in as he clawed at it, his desperation mounting with each futile attempt. Just as the terror threatened to consume him, the mask yielded, peeling away from his face with a sudden release. He gasped in relief, the cool air on his sweaty skin a balm to his fears. Holding the mask in his hands, Alessandro took in the grotesque features, the bizarre charm that had first drawn him in, now a thing of horror. It was no longer just a curiosity from a foreign land. It was a symbol of a terrifying power that had chosen him, a power that was not entirely unwelcome. Amidst the terror, Alessandro couldn't ignore the intoxicating rush that had coursed through him when the mask was on his face. It was a surge of raw, primal energy that had left him feeling invincible, an allure that was as powerful as it was terrifying. Over the next few days, Alessandro tried to restore normalcy to his life. He went about his daily routine, the mask locked away in a drawer, a dark secret that haunted his every moment. The incident with the intruder had rattled him, but it was the power that had surged through him that left him truly shaken. It was like a drug, the memory of the feeling calling to him in quiet moments. A week passed before he dared to touch the mask again. The night was quiet, the moon bathing his room in a silvery glow. Trembling slightly, he lifted the mask, its grotesque features more terrifying in the dim light. With a heavy breath, he pressed it against his face, once again becoming the vessel for the demonic entity trapped within. The rush of power was immediate and overwhelming, a wild, untamed energy that seemed to set his very blood on fire. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and entirely intoxicating. The world seemed sharper, the night brighter, the quiet more profound. He felt invincible, but with the euphoria came the terror. He could feel the demonic entity, an ancient and powerful force brushing against his consciousness. It was a horrifying realization, the feeling of another presence within him, a malevolent force that sought control. In a sudden panic, Alessandro yanked at the mask, fear lending him strength. It was a struggle, the mask clinging to him as if reluctant to let go. But with a last desperate tug, he managed to tear it off, gasping as the rush of power abruptly vanished. Alessandro was left trembling in the aftermath, the mask a silent, menacing presence in his hands. He realized with a chilling certainty that he was now bound to a power he couldn't control, a power that promised ecstasy and terror in equal measures. The mask, once an intriguing novelty, had now become an ominous symbol of a pact he had not intended to make. Overwhelmed by the fear and the irresistible allure of the power granted by the mask, Alessandro found himself drawn to it again and again. The mask seemed to have a mind of its own, compelling him to wear it, promising untold power and liberation from his mundane existence. Each time he put on the mask, he could feel the rush of power flooding him, a surge of raw, primal energy that left him breathless. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a surge of invincibility that set his senses on fire and made the world seem brighter, louder, more vivid. He was no longer just Alessandro Montanari, the businessman. He was a force of nature, a vessel of unfathomable power. But with the power came the fear. A terrifying sense of loss gripped him as he felt the mask tightening its hold on his identity. The demonic entity within the mask was powerful, ancient, and it was slowly but surely consuming him. Each time he put on the mask, he could feel himself slipping away, his own consciousness being pushed aside by the entity's overpowering presence. He was losing himself, being drowned in the intoxicating sea of power the mask granted. In his desperate quest for answers, Alessandro turned to researching the mask. He pored over ancient texts, obscure legends, and obscure internet forums, seeking any information about the mask and its origins. His search led him down a dark path, filled with tales of horror and madness, death and destruction. The mask, it seemed, had a sinister past. It had been a part of numerous legends and myths, passed down from generation to generation, always associated with death and devastation. It was believed to be a cursed object, housing a powerful demon who granted its wearer unimaginable power. But every tale ended in tragedy, with the wearer losing their life in horrifying circumstances, unable to withstand the sheer force of the power they had been granted. The revelation sent chills down Alessandro's spine. He was no longer just wearing a mask. He was carrying the weight of centuries of death and destruction on his face. The mask had chosen him, and he was spiraling down the same path of horror that its previous wearers had faced. Unable to bear the thought, Alessandro tried to remove the mask, to break free from the terrifying fate he had unwittingly invited. But the mask refused to yield. It clung to his face, its demonic presence laughing at his futile attempts to resist. He could feel his own reflection being wiped away, replaced by the grotesque visage of the mask. He was losing himself to the mask, being consumed by the demonic entity within. His world was now a dichotomy of terror and power. He could feel the raw energy coursing through his veins, a seductive promise of invincibility. But beneath the exhilaration was the paralyzing fear of losing his identity, of being erased and replaced by the mask's demonic entity. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, Alessandro Montanari, the businessman from Naples, was gone. In his place was a demonic visage, a symbol of a horrifying power that had chosen him as its vessel. His life was no longer his own. He had been drowned in power, lost to the mask and its sinister past. The terror of his fate was a cold, hard truth he couldn't escape. He was a prisoner of the mask, bound to meet the same gruesome end as its previous wearers. He was drowning in power, and there was no respite in sight. The mask's hold on Alessandro grew increasingly tyrannical. It didn't just cling to his face now, it leached into his psyche, warping his personality, turning him into something he barely recognized. The entity within the mask was insidious, whispering sweet promises of power while gradually eroding his human sensibilities. The once disciplined businessman found himself succumbing to a disturbing bloodlust. It was an insatiable craving, a call from the depths of the entity that echoed within him. It started subtly, with an enhanced aggression, a peculiar satisfaction in conflicts. Soon, however, it transformed into something far more sinister. The sight of blood, once something that made him squeamish, became strangely satisfying. The taste for violence, the entity's inherent nature, began to overpower his own instincts. Each altercation, each drop of blood spilt, seemed to feed the demonic entity, making it stronger, more dominant. All the while, Alessandro remained a prisoner within his own body, a silent spectator to the macabre spectacle that his life had become. He was both the puppet and the audience in this terrifying theater, forced to witness the horror of his transformation without the power to intervene. Haunted by the mask's gruesome history and his impending doom, he attempted everything to free himself from this terrifying grip. He sought the help of priests, consulted occultists, even attempted to tear the mask off his face, but it was all in vain. The mask seemed to revel in his desperation, tightening its grip with every failed attempt. His reflection in the mirror no longer belonged to Alessandro Montanari. All he saw was the grotesque visage of the mask, its demonic grin a cruel mockery of his desperate predicament. With each passing day, the human behind the mask was being systematically erased, replaced by the entity's bloodthirsty persona. Amidst the terrifying ordeal, a realization dawned upon him. He was no longer in control. He was a passenger in his own body, forced to witness the horrifying transformation that the mask was orchestrating. He was on a path of destruction, hurtling towards a grisly end, with the bloodlust of the demonic entity driving him forward. The dance of demise had begun. It was a ghastly waltz led by the mask, with Alessandro, its unwilling partner, bound to follow its dreadful rhythm. All he could do was brace for the horrifying finale, a gruesome fate that had been etched from the moment he first donned the mask. His struggle, his desperation, his fear, it all seemed to fuel the dance, intensifying the mask's bloodthirsty grip. Caught in this terrifying dance, Alessandro Montanari accepted his grisly fate. As he plunged deeper into the bloodlust, he was acutely aware of the horrific end that awaited him. The dance was nearing its culmination, and all he could do was surrender to the rhythm, to the bloodlust, and to the impending doom. Under the mask's control, Alessandro descended into an abyss of violence and madness. His humanity was completely eclipsed by the demonic entity's bloodlust, transforming him into a tool of chaos and destruction. The once dignified businessman was now a terror in the heart of Naples. Nights were filled with screams as he succumbed to the entity's thirst for blood. His victims were chosen randomly, their lives extinguished in a horrific dance of death. Each act of violence fueling the mask's power, each drop of blood staining not just his hands, but his soul. This reign of terror persisted, sending shockwaves through the city. The once lively and bustling Naples was now clouded with fear, its streets echoing with whispered tales of a demonic murderer. Alessandro, caught in this cycle of violence, was a prisoner to the mask's will, his existence reduced to a horrifying nightmare. But every dance has its final act, and Alessandro's dance of demise was nearing its ghastly finale. The mask's power had reached its peak, and with it, Alessandro's life force was diminishing. He could feel the life being drained out of him, replaced by an ominous coldness that crept from the mask into his very soul. One fateful night, Alessandro found himself at the steps of an old cathedral. The mask, as if aware of its host's impending end, drove him to this sacred ground. As he staggered into the cathedral, his body frail and his spirit crushed, he collapsed at the foot of a large crucifix. In this holy place, the mask's grip seemed to weaken, giving Alessandro a brief moment of lucidity. With his last ounce of strength, he looked up at the crucifix, a silent plea in his eyes. But before he could utter a prayer, the mask reclaimed control. The church echoed with a demonic roar, and Alessandro Montanari breathed his last. The gruesome legacy of Alessandro's possession sent chills down the spines of the people of Naples. The tales of his horrific end and the mask's curse lingered, a haunting specter that served as a chilling reminder of the terrifying dance of power and demise. Even in death, Alessandro was not free. The mask remained, its grotesque features frozen in a demonic grin. It was found on the cathedral floor, alongside Alessandro's lifeless body, waiting for its next dance partner, its next victim, to be entranced by its horrific charm. Thus, the dance of demise had its finale, but the mask's terrifying symphony was far from over. Its silent, ominous presence promised a future filled with horror, its dance card open for the next unwitting participant in its deadly waltz.